Hello from Alliance Magazine and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by Cambridge Judge Business School's Centre for Strategic Philanthropy. I'm Charles Keedon, the Executive Editor of Alliance Magazine and the moderator of today's webinar. We've just reached a milestone here at Alliance. It's our 25th year. Thanks to all of you for the trust you place in our coverage of global philanthropy. And we're celebrating with 25 moments throughout the year. I'm happy to offer everyone on this webinar a 25% discount on an Alliance subscription. Just use the code Alliance25 in the offers button on the right-hand side of your screen. In today's webinar, we're looking at the possibilities for the emergence of a new balance of power in philanthropy. According to research published by the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy last month, COVID-19 has accelerated an already existing trend, the shifting of the North-South power balance in philanthropy away from the global North and towards the global South. The research was led by the academic director of the Centre, Dr. Kamal Munir, and its executive director, Clare Woodcraft. They argue, and I quote, that the time is ripe for a radical rethink of global South philanthropy, not only in getting resources to where they are most needed locally, but also in contributing to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Yet the research also notes that this awakening is impeded by weak philanthropy infrastructure and networks, insufficient collaboration, and a lack of core funding. So to discuss what this all means for the development of philanthropy around the world, I'm delighted to be joined by Clare and Kamal, as well as SATRIJO TANUDJOJO, the CEO of the Tanoto Foundation, a leading family foundation in Indonesia. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Degan Ali from Adeso in Kenya, an organization calling for a shake-up of the aid and philanthropy sectors. And before I hand over to the authors of the research, we just want to start the conversation with a poll question. So if you can look at the right-hand side of your screen, and in order to answer the first poll question, the question is, do you agree that the balance of power in philanthropy needs to shift away from the global North? And you'll see some answers you can give. A, you strongly agree. B, you agree. C, you disagree. D, you strongly disagree. And E, you're not sure. And if indeed you're not sure, feel free to say why in the chats as well. I'm just going to give you a moment just to respond to that poll. So just looking at the initial results from all of you here today, and we're expecting, I think, over 200 of you, we have a strong agreement on the part of 59% of respondents and agreement on the part of 35%. So there seems to be uniformity amongst everyone here that actually there does need to be a shift in the balance of power. I should say that the time in the webinar means that we are unlikely to have as many respondents from the United States, which might have skewed these findings. But nonetheless, it is striking that many of you here do feel that there needs to be a shift. And with that, I'd like to just give the floor to the authors of the research at Cambridge, Kamal, Munir and Clare Woodcraft. So over to you, Clare.
Great, thanks, Charles. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. A big thank you to Alliance for being a great partner for the Centre since we established only last year. And I should start by saying that, you know, in a way, the CSP is a little biased when it comes to the shift in the balance of power, because our very mission from the outset, as per the vision of our founder, Badr Jafar, was really to look at the global South, philanthropy in the global South, and specifically in three core emerging markets, so the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, because there is a significant dearth of information, data, and research in those markets, and yet they show huge potential in terms of growth and in terms of up-and-coming second-generation philanthropists. So we were very keen to examine that in our first report that was really triggered by COVID-19. It wasn't something that we planned at the establishment of the Centre, but that actually coincided. So we really wanted to understand better not only how COVID-19 had impacted best practice in the global South, but also whether the nature and the gravity of the crisis actually triggered changes in best practice that had been long called for. I've personally worked in emerging markets most of my career in philanthropy, and to me, I think the pandemic has really brought us to something of a tipping point in terms of how we deploy philanthropic capital and how we maximize impact. To many extents, I think the system is broken, and that's really something that we found during our research. And indeed, that has been echoed by many since the publication of our report, including yourself, Charles, in your recent commentary and your 5 points looking at how there needs to be a root and branch change in philanthropy and really talking truth to power. We've also seen how the Global Fund for Community Foundations, one of the organizations we interviewed, has recently published an open letter calling for #shift the power and really have developed a manifesto for change. And we are also currently doing some preliminary work with Becky Moyo, who I'm sure people on the call will be familiar with, of CAPSI in South Africa, around, again, looking at how local NGOs can scale and build their capacity. So I think the topic is really gaining traction. I think the time is ripe, as we said in our report. And I think that this all bodes well for some really long-term systemic changes in the way we do philanthropy. I'm going to quickly touch on some of the core points of our report. I believe that people on the call have already had access to the link to look at the report themselves, and we would really love to get feedback from people if they haven't had a chance to look at it, but to do so later on. We went out into the market at a difficult time. The crisis had just hit, and of course the last thing really philanthropists or social purpose organizations in these markets were able to do was free up 1 hour for a piece of research. So we were very grateful that people did make time. They saw the importance of this piece of research. So our initial interviews were undertaken during difficult circumstances, and yet we found people very willing to talk about this topic. We interviewed over 25 social purpose organizations in those markets, and some also in the global north who are working extensively with those markets. They included social entrepreneurs, foundations, NGOs, intermediaries, and global foundations investing in those markets. And really what we found was a rich array of issues that rose to the surface because of COVID, had already been bubbling underneath for some time. We saw much greater flexibility around how grants are allocated and dispersed. We saw much greater solidarity across intra-regionally through social purpose organizations. We saw a maximization of using digital tools as a way of understanding better the situation and notably sharing data. And we saw, notably from interviewees such as Degan, and I'm sure she'll share more with you on this, a real growth in solidarity and around peer learning and peer funding, and an acknowledgement that the time is over for social purpose organizations in emerging markets to be dependent on funding from the global north. And we concluded in our report with 3 recommendations that we think can help further encourage this shift of power balance, and more importantly, perhaps change practice in the sector such that it is more aligned with the actual needs of the global south. Those are encouraging governments to work more closely with Global South philanthropists. I'm sure SATRIJO will talk more about the amazing work that Tanoto Foundation is doing in that respect, something which traditionally hadn't necessarily happened, where foundations were working with governments. Second recommendation, really making sure that there is investment in infrastructure. That means networks, that means organizations like Alliance, it means organizations like networks in the Global South who can share learning, share best practice, and share data. And finally, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone on this call, core funding, core funding, core funding. For decades now, we have been calling for unrestricted funding, getting to the sector, getting to social purpose organizations so that they can decide where the money is best allocated and really build resilience, build their own institutional resilience so they can better deal with crises of the like of COVID. Let me stop there and hand back to you, Charles. I'm happy to take further questions on the report later.
Thank you, and thank you for that overview of some of the key questions and recommendations. Just want to turn to Kamal. Helpfully, Kamal, Ilana Silva and Harold Glasser in the chats have asked the question about what power means in the context of a shift in the balance of power. And I know that's what you were going to open with some observations on that. So the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Although Clare has already pointed out, a number of things that are salient in our report. Let me just share my reflections on it. I mean, when we started interviewing, very quickly, some themes began to emerge from our chats and long, detailed conversations with people who were actually in the trenches and working on completely reorienting their work and their organizations during the pandemic. And one of those themes, perhaps the most salient theme, that to emerge was this underlying tension, right, between the North, the global North, and the global South that had perhaps existed for decades. But as the famous ethnomethodologist Irving Goffman said, disruptions, when there are radical disruptions, it provides us with an excellent opportunity to learn about how society actually works. And so he used to cause disruptions in order to, in his experiments, he would cause disruptions to actually learn how people behaved when they did not have a script. So the underlying, tensions and relationships and understandings would emerge that way. Now, a number of people referred to this power balance, and they said, we don't want to take dictation from Global North foundations anymore. And in this pandemic, a very interesting thing happened, because in any crisis, in a hierarchical decision-making structure, it is no longer enough for the decisions to be made at the top, because the knowledge is being generated in real time at the front lines, on the front lines. So there has to be collaboration between the top and the people who are manning the front line. So there has to be collaboration. And that is what, a necessity was felt for that collaboration. And that made people realize that a different way of doing this is possible. Not in all cases, but wherever it happened, people realized that, wow, there is a different way in which things can happen, and it can actually lead to much more optimal outcomes. Now, what do we mean when we couch all this in terms of the power balance? So as a couple of people on our chat pointed out, what is power? Power is simply something that allows us to persuade others to do things that we think they should do. Okay? So resource dependence, because there are a few big northern foundations and there are lots of grantees in the emerging markets. This resource dependence simply means that the parameters in which philanthropy was practiced were set by these northern foundations. What the funding was for, what it was not for. There's a long process of both getting the funding and reporting on the progress and so on. So the disruption lifted the lid on this imbalance of power. Now, what is interesting about power is, one of the most perhaps repeated and often misunderstood aspect of power is attributed to a French philosopher called Foucault, who said knowledge is power. And people simply think it means that whoever has more knowledge has more power. That is not what he meant. Right? What he meant was that power is embodied in knowledge. So if I learn to do things according to what Clare teaches me, she's exercising power over me. There is no violence, there is no subjugation, oppression involved here. I have already internalized her worldview. Okay? So when somebody gets to set the parameters within which you're going to do your thinking and your acting, they are exercising power over you. Okay? And so if I am not doing things indigenously, developing indigenous capabilities and capacity, I am not challenging the current balance of power. So the power balance can only shift if we start developing indigenous capabilities. And there is much to learn, of course, for emerging market foundations from the illustrious history, often illustrious history, not always, of philanthropy in the West. But yet, I think, and we think in the center, that emerging markets should find their own or forge their own path. And should not simply follow the map that has already been drawn. And that can only happen if, first of all, there is this realization. So that, to me, is perhaps the strongest message that our report sends.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for that fascinating account of what power means in this context, and the recourse to some of the philosophers, which is sometimes all too rare in conversations about philanthropy, but I think is particularly helpful to orient theoretically what we're talking about in practice. Before I turn to our respondents, I want to just go to the poll again. We've got a second question, which is really to ask you if some of the barriers are to be overcome. What will need to happen in your experience to overcome some of the barriers to that more equal and geographically balanced philanthropy sector and society that Kamal was talking about? So if you go to the second poll question, in your experience, what is the biggest barrier to the growth of philanthropy across the global south? Is it weak philanthropy infrastructure, lack of collaboration between philanthropy and government, or NGOs lacking resilience because of a shortage of core funding? Or is it something else? And if it is something else, please feel free to say in the chat what you think it is. And that something else might relate to some of the points that Kamal was making. Just give a few moments just to set out what you think is the main barrier. So over 50% of you are saying that actually a shortage of core funding is leading to a lack of resilience amongst NGOs, or around 50% of you. Around 30% are saying that weak philanthropy infrastructure and networks in comparison to northern counterparts. And a smaller number, just over 10%, are highlighting a lack of collaboration between philanthropy and government, and 12% saying other. And I'll be having a look at the chat to try and pick up on some of those points. But thank you for those very interesting responses to the opening comments. I'm now very happy to turn to SATRIJO TANUDJOJO of the Tanoto Foundation in Indonesia. And you're quoted in the research, SATRIJO, as saying that COVID has almost been a calling for local philanthropy in Indonesia. I wonder if you can just expand on that and give us your reflections on what you're hearing here. Thank you.
Okay, well, the question is also about the power shifting, etc. But allow me, please, to share some context about Indonesia to understand the trend in the philanthropy sector. So in the past 2 decades, Indonesia has shown a strong economic performance. Now, the 18th rank in the world economy, Indonesia has successfully boosted its GDP tremendously, bringing prosperity to its people. Of course, poverty still exists at some degree, but at a lower rate. Actually, it is at a single digit, around 9% level, as compared to about 19% in the year 2000s. In fact, last year, the World Bank upgraded Indonesia's status from lower middle income countries, the status it had held since 2006, to upper middle income countries. Along with this economic growth and improvement in all sectors, Indonesia is naturally disqualified for many international aids. For example, one of Indonesia's biggest aid source, AusAid, means from Australia, the total investment in Indonesia is reduced significantly in the last 3 years. Many international NGOs have started to conduct domestic fundraising and diversify the funding basis to finance the Indonesia-based programs. It's a clear indication of a shift in funding. As of today, study shows foreign aid covers around 70% the development fund in Indonesia. The rest is from other sources. The experts predicted further decline of support for Indonesia and actually recommend the more sustainable financing ratio of foreign versus local in the proportion of 1:3. Well, it's fortunate for us in Indonesia that we see the rising potential for local philanthropy and private sector funding in Indonesia, and probably the power of shift. I mean, the shift of power. Sharing some statistic is that there's a promising trend that the philanthropy industry in Indonesia actually is growing bigger. The old statistic in 2013 to 2014, so within 1 year, actually, it grows from $900 million to 1.2, 1.3 billion, so it's 50% growth. But interestingly, actually, the individual giving to charity, let me take an example of the faith-based charity or faith-based giving, is from Zakat. You know, in 2015, it was $140 million from the individual giving only. And in 2019, that means in 4 years, it has increased from 140 to 270 million. So it's almost double. And it has increased significantly. Another interesting phenomena, there is also a significant growth of high net worth individual who set up the philanthropy arms. Tanoto Foundation, our investment in education in Indonesia alone grew steadily of almost threefolds in the past 3 years, from $3 million to more than $10 million. The Tanoto Foundation, we believe that quality education accelerates equal opportunity. Therefore, we harness the power of education to improve people's life. So globally, we cover China, Singapore, and Indonesia. Tanoto Foundation's giving also doubled from less than 10 million, now is around 22, 23 million US dollars. So Indonesians are known to be generous in giving. It's our nature, if you wish. Nonetheless, philanthropy is still pretty much driven by individual donations, which is not systematic, difficult to track, and difficult to measure its efficacy, and mostly sporadic or ad hoc in nature, for example, for disaster relief or orphanages. This is especially carried out through faith-based organizations, as what I mentioned before. The question is why institutional philanthropy has yet to thrive in Indonesia. Indonesia ranks 56 out of 64 countries assessed in 2015, the Index of Philanthropy Freedom. This low rank means that Indonesia's philanthropic environment is considered not conducive to institutional philanthropy. I repeat, to institutional philanthropy. A study by Center for Asia Philanthropy and Society, or CAPS, put Indonesia in the category of not doing enough. The challenges remain to be around the process, the tax incentives, and the capability or the capacity. It is encouraging and promising, though, that the government today is increasingly forward-thinking in terms of trying to integrate multiple stakeholders' perspectives into the national development agenda. I can talk a lot of examples from private-private, public-private partnerships that Tanoto Foundation is also very much involved in. Okay, on another note, COVID-19 may change the dynamics and landscape of giving in Indonesia, as the poverty rate is predicted to increase further, unfortunately, from a single digit to go back to double digit, probably 10.5, 11%, which is equivalent to 28 million people in poverty in 2021. This calls for local philanthropy to make contribution to various social causes that would be affected by reallocation of government and foreign finance to combat the pandemic. Sectors that are important but highly vulnerable for funding prioritization include early childhood education and development, especially because of the lack of formal institutional structure. The World Bank predicted the learning loss due to school closing of 6 months to be equivalent to 16 points for reading in the PISA test. Very significant. In short, I talked many things already, but in short, the data does show some evidence of declining overseas funding to Indonesia. This provides a bigger room for local philanthropists to play a role. However, to further encourage giving, Indonesia has a lot of homework to do in terms of removing institutional barriers and increasing capacity. However, the government is very encouraging with their effort. So that's my response to this research. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, SATRIJO, for your overview and perspective from Indonesia. Just before we turn to Degan, just a question about your own family foundation and the increasing giving and leadership that you're taking where you are. How do you decide how much to give and where to give? Is that something that's driven by the needs you're assessing, or by the decline of overseas funding, or about the decisions from the family itself on the level?
I think it's multiple considerations. Of course, it comes from the funding itself. So how much can we spend? So there is a mandate that so much that we can spend. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that how do we spend? So we look into evidence-based. So we work based on evidence-based. We did some research. What do we need? If we want to invest in education in Indonesia, then where do we invest? So in 2017, we hired McKinsey to really look into in which landscape should we invest. And then they come up with just a story. Indonesia has no problem with the infrastructure of schools. We have enough schools after so many years of building schools. Yet to improve the quality of education in Indonesia, we need to improve the quality of the teaching, the teachers and the principals, and also the early childhood education and development part of it. So that's where we invest. Now, the question is not giving money and invest. The question is, how much can we do? The funding is available, but it is not that you give the money and everything is solved. So we really need to understand what can we do. So we did some further study. For example, in the early childhood education, as you know, Indonesia is also very high in our stunting rate, which now we are fighting very much. You know, I always say that stunting is not the fault of the children. Stunted children is because of the ignorance of the adults. So therefore, we need to really understand what causes this and how we can improve. Because stunted children, you cannot expect that they can have a highly quality education. I think you understand about that. And therefore, we also address that. So everything we do is evidence-based and then impact-based. If we do invest, then we ask ourselves, what do we get out of this in terms of the future development that we can engage with? So that's the way I see it.
Thank you, SATRIJO, both for giving us insights into the decision-making process at your foundation, and also for bringing attention to questions around early childhood development, particularly at a time when children are unable in many places around the world to go to school at the moment. So appreciate that. Now I'm going to turn from Asia to a perspective from Africa. And here we have Degan Ali, who's been, and her organization, Adeso, has been a critic, really calling for a shake-up of the way that overseas aid and development and philanthropy is practiced. And it's a real pleasure to have Degan with us today. She was a star contributor, I understand, to the research that Cambridge conducted. And warm welcome to you, Degan. Over to you for your thoughts on these questions.
Thank you all for having me. I remember when I first had that conversation with Clare many months ago. Gosh, time goes so fast. I want to first make a few points. One, to say that I think we have to be very careful in trying to fit a square into a round hole. We are always viewing everything through a Western lens. And the assumption is that philanthropy has to mimic in the North, the South has to mimic the North. And what we don't appreciate is that philanthropy happens every single day in volunteerism, in money that is given, many, actually I would say and challenge and say that the most philanthropic people, the highest amount of giving actually happens from the poor. And I think there's many studies to prove that. Actually, I don't think that's an assertion that I'm making alone. But because it's invisible, it's informal, it's not properly documented, therefore people don't place much value and weight on it. And therefore it seems that what we are trying to do is to say we want the formalized foundations and institutions that are tracking, that are doing everything, these grand scales. We want to mimic the Ford Foundations and the Rockefellers and the Kellogg's, and we want to have them in Africa or Asia or wherever it may be. And I would say that that's not really what we should be aspiring to do. What we should be aspiring to do is trying to figure out what works for us. I would like philanthropy in Somalia, for instance, to be done in a more organized way, in a way that is more professionalized and tracked properly, but I don't think it has to necessarily model what is happening in the US or Europe. And I think that somehow we also have to give the value to the philanthropy that already exists in the billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year in the global South that is undocumented, that's not traced. And so I think finding a balance between professionalization and making sure that it's done in a cohesive way, and that I'm not funding the same orphanage that 20,000 other people are funding, or the same relative, extended family that other relatives are funding, because we all fund a relative, we all fund school fees, we all do all types of things. We don't talk about, we don't publicize, but we do it every single day. So we do need a better way to professionalize and organize it, but we don't necessarily need to model the Northern system. That's one thing I would like to, and I don't necessarily have one-size-fits-all solution that I can suggest right now, but I do think that we just have to get away from this idea of scale and big and monolith kind of institutions is what we want in Africa. Second thing I would like to say, I do agree that we do need some investments in the infrastructures, but I actually am glad to see that there's 46% of the audience who agrees that one of the biggest problems in this space is the issue of core funding. For me, this is one of the things that has been there for many, many years, but it came to a head during COVID, where we saw the flight of the INGOs, we saw the flight of the UN, we saw the flight of the traditional donors leaving our countries, and we were left to our own resources. I actually think that's a good thing. I actually think that's a positive thing, because it forced us to finally reflect and say, wait a minute, what resources do we have on our own? Somalia being a fragile country, having these kinds of constant negative connotations of being helpless, always food insecure, 2 famines in modern history, but there is huge amounts. What is sustaining the average Somali is not the aid. What is sustaining the average Somali is the social support networks. What is sustaining the average Somali is the diaspora remittance. What is sustaining the average Somali is the philanthropy that every single family member gives to extended family. This concept of zakat in Indonesia, generally Muslims and faith-based communities in general are some of the highest donors. And that is what is sustaining Somalia, not the aid community. And so for me, I think the COVID was an opportunity for us to start thinking about self-reliance, to start thinking about how do we come together and fund our own initiatives. And I can talk about some of the things that we did together collectively as local NGOs, and try. But it's also about changing the mindset and really deprogramming ourselves from becoming passive recipients of aid, but really trying to make ourselves more active agents of our own development. And that is one of the biggest problems I feel like the aid system has done, is not only created dependency at the community level, but dependency on civil society at the level of the NGOs themselves, where we just are waiting for the next grant from UNICEF, are waiting for the next grant from Save the Children or Oxfam, rather than thinking about how do we become financially self-sufficient and self-reliant. And this is the journey that Adeso is going through, and has been going through for the past few years, pre-COVID, and I think expedited during COVID, is to say that we need to figure out how to not be dependent any longer and how to become financially self-sufficient in the future, and break the cycle of dependency. And so for me, I think that those are really the exciting opportunities that COVID has presented. Is trying to push ourselves as civil society in the global South to start taking over ownership of our own future, and not just sit there passively as we have for a long, long time. So I could speak a lot about this topic, but because I only had 5 and I've gone over my 5, let me just stop there and just say, I think the onus and the challenge is on us, ourselves, as the global South, as Africans, as civil society. And while we can make a lot of recommendations for global North philanthropy, and I have a ton of them, the real work needs to be done on ourselves, for our people and for our own institutions.
Thank you very much, Degan, for that very clear kind of exposition of what needs to be done, what some of the challenges are, and I'm sure that will generate a lot of comment. And I want to just turn to some of the comments in the chat before going back to each of you for responses to any of the issues that arise that you feel you want to respond to. But Felicity Jones asks, what would the panel identify as best practice in these shifts of power, given so many funders of all kinds do not focus on the areas recommended? That's one from her. Eleni asks, instead of injecting funding or grants and creating bubble economies, we could engage in venture philanthropy and social investment practices to stimulate economic growth. What do you think about that? Boychoko, and I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, is basically saying that Kamal is advocating for decolonization. I presume that's a reference to your conceptions about embodied power and the way that colonization works. You might want to just expand on that. There was a question about how the Tanoto Foundation measures impact, but that's actually been addressed very kindly by SATRIJO in the chats. Dana Doran, who's a scholar at the Indiana School of Philanthropy, or the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in the US, makes the point that philanthropy is really everywhere in the global south, but rarely counted, which seems to resonate with Degan's point about the way that these informal networks of giving maybe just don't register in the way that the other forms of giving might. So just wanted to pick out some of those and then go back to each of you on the panel just for your thoughts on any of those. Maybe we'll start back with you, Clare, just for your initial reflections, please.
Sure, absolutely. And I think, I think collectively we should be looking at voice, just to pick up on Degan's point, voice and local voice and taking local ownership. I think that's really important. But I want to pick up on two specifically of the questions. I should say my experience as a practitioner is mainly in the Middle East. And I think there, so somebody was asking, I think it was Felicity, about, what can we do in terms of Northern foundations having best practice? I think we need to look first and foremost at those local markets. And I've seen firsthand how in the Middle East, governments are really struggling to manage philanthropic capital. And hence there is very little directive on what is best practice. There's often a move to restrict flows of philanthropic capital for historic reasons. And I think that's something that we can address collectively, really supporting the development of local regulation that meets local market needs, but isn't this knee-jerk, almost fearful response that then ends up restricting. So I think there's really an opportunity here. And what we found in our research was foundations such as Tanoto, but also others in other markets, saying that we've never really historically worked with the government. But for example, around education, they came to us, they knew we were looking at education, they knew that we had a digital education program and asked us to help them digitize. In some cases, we cite, for example, a YTL Foundation in Malaysia, sort of almost single-handedly helping the country to put education online. So I think that's more that we'd like to see more of that kind of collaboration, local innovation, working with local governments to help them understand that philanthropy is here as a potential partner for you. It's not competition. We know as philanthropists, we cannot create sustainable socioeconomic outcomes alone. We have to be in partnership with a broader ecosystem. So I think that's really something we need to keep a close eye on. And just on venture philanthropy, so I've long been a proponent of venture philanthropy in the sense that it takes a market-based approach, looking at what are the gaps in the market. So let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's not duplicate what others are already doing. But I think we also need to be careful if we just look at those kinds of models. I mean, obviously that one comes from venture capital. It's a very global north, if not perhaps Californian model. And to Degan's point, venture philanthropy may not be the right form of philanthropy for these emerging markets. In the recent book by Paul Vallely, he actually calls out strategic philanthropy or venture philanthropy and says it ignores the kind of philanthropy again was talking about that's really grassroots based and is happening on a daily basis. So I think it's these constructs that we need to visit. The lexicon of philanthropy has been too couched in language of the global north, and that needs to change.
Thank you, Claire. And Kamal, just over to you, just to respond briefly to one or two of the points that have been made in the chat.
So let me pick up on the point about decolonizing. I think Boichoko is right. I am, I suppose, asking for decolonizing philanthropy. Right? And decolonizing, of course, works in subtle ways. I mean, it is not always accompanied by naked power or violence, physical or symbolic. Right? And it can come in forms of textbooks. And similarly, it can come in the form of setting parameters within which we are going to act, and what our funding is going to be used for and what it is not going to be used for. So, for example, I'm not saying that, you know, what Gates Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation or all these people are doing in emerging markets is not worth anything. Far from it. But there are much fewer positive externalities to relying on funding from these large foundations. So, for example, a positive externality you might consider is on the social fabric. When the giving is local, when the decision making is local, you can imagine that the social fabric actually strengthens as a result of that. And trust strengthens in society across classes. And so all those things you are losing out on when you rely on external funders. Let me give you an example. Let's say we want to preserve or conserve snow leopards in the north of Pakistan. And there is a lot of funding that has come over the years to conserve snow leopards in the north. And so I know people who have been doing that job. And what they tell me is that, okay, you know, we have been working with the community. The foundations who are giving us money, they see this as a biological problem. And they see this from a natural sciences perspective. And we want to actually approach the problem from a more social science perspective. And we want to consider the ecosystem as one in which the humans, the villagers who live in the north, and the snow leopard are both part of that ecosystem. That requires a fundamentally different approach. Right? That requires funding not only the snow leopard, but also some projects in the villagers. Except that they have found that the foundations who are willing to conserve snow leopards are not willing to put money into the villagers. And so, you know, how sustainable these projects are and how deeply rooted these projects are. You know, this reliance on external funding continues to ask questions on that front.
Thank you, Kamal. And I'm going to go straight to SATRIJO just for his response. And just wanted to ask you, do you think there's an issue, SATRIJO, of replacing or replicating large foundations in the global north with large foundations in the global south? Because you represent a large family foundation in Indonesia, whereas some of the things we're hearing are about small giving and local giving and informal networks and grassroots power. So how do you navigate that? Are you rooted in the story of kind of large philanthropy, or are you rooted more in the kind of story of grassroots global south philanthropy, or somewhere in between?
Okay, thank you. Well, Tanoto Foundation is large enough. It's not extremely large. So we work based on partnership also. You know? So let me start with that. You know, that in our experience in philanthropy in the region, tells us that networks are important catalysts to accelerate partnership, including for the smaller resources. You know that the local philanthropists in Asia, while massive in numbers, in the education sector, for example, only 20% philanthropic organizations in Indonesia are real donors. Only 20% are real donors. The rest are either implementers or intermediaries. Moreover, they rarely have large-scale operations that can match those foreign investment, obviously. You know, if I take, let me take an example of philanthropy in Indonesia, where we have almost 100 members, 70% of it have annual giving of less than $350,000 US. So this makes collaboration with government for sustainable and impactful development a challenge. The way Tanoto Foundation works since 2017, 2018 until now and further is that we always work in partnership with the government. We may partner with other parties, but we always have government in it. At least it has to be endorsed by this government. Networks can promote higher level of collaboration, such as pool funding. You talk about this smaller funding, but we can have a pool funding. The approach which allows philanthropy to hire professional technical experts and have sufficient skills, factors that are considered appealing to the government counterpart. Tanoto Foundation itself works through Asia Philanthropic Circle, Philanthropy Indonesia, Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, ARNEC, in the early childhood education part. I'll give you an example is that together with the government, we work with the World Bank to address some stunting subject in Indonesia. And with that, we also put a few million US dollars, and through World Bank and through the government of Indonesia, we also invited Gates Foundation to contribute some part of it. So that creates some sort of a partnership, which is very important. Another program that I would like to also share with you, that a collaboration among 3 philanthropists in Indonesia, big and small, and then we engage the local NGO to create a program, what we call an inspirasi program, to really address the leadership skill of the principal. That was catalyzed by the Asia Philanthropic Circle. So that is a kind of some examples that I can share. That transfer of knowledge from north to south still happens at a certain degree, particularly with the right use of international consultants in it. Documentation of what works is rarely a practice in Indonesia because most resources are invested in program implementation. Rigorous research such as RCT can be difficult to justify. A study of scholarship management practices benchmarking that we conducted shows that monitoring and evaluation is a big area. For example, there is no alignment of the intended goals and measurement indicators, and around a third of the organization measures. So the key things in collaboration, be it with smaller or bigger NGOs, I would say is the monitoring and evaluation of it. That's the way that I would contribute.
Thank you for your thoughts, and very interesting to hear about the exchange of knowledge with the global north in inverted commas and the partnership of foundations in some of the programs you're describing. If I can turn to Degan, just for your thoughts on the discussion and where it's going, and also just struck, if I may, just by your observation about the challenges of aid dependency and the giving to UNICEF, Save the Children, and Oxfam and others. You highlighted it almost as if it would be better if that didn't happen, not because those organizations are bad, but because they distract attention from the self-reliance that needs to be engendered in order to create the change. So I just wondered, would you go as far as to say actually donors in the global north should stop backing these NGOs because they're forestalling the kinds of changes you want to see?
Yeah, that's a good question. I struggle with that because if it was up to me and seeing the 20 plus years of being in Somalia, my own country, and witnessing the havoc that aid has wrought on the country, I actually would have said that aid shouldn't even exist in Somalia anymore. I would remove all of it. I would remove the UNs, I would remove the INGOs, I would remove even majority of the local NGOs. I would remove majority of these humanitarian programs, would actually be talking about more longer term infrastructure development programs with the government. I would be talking about capacity building with the government. I'd be talking about things that create jobs and stop the dependency on humanitarian assistance. But we're not in that kind of ideal world where I can just take a brush and remove everybody from a context. But that's reality. If you want to really hear the hard truth, we've done more damage than we've helped. But if I was to be politically correct, I would say then that I'm not asking for INGOs to stop existing. I think there is a role for them. I think there's an important role for them, but I think it's a different role. And what we need to stop doing, and that includes the UN, is leave the service delivery to the governments, let the governments demonstrate and have sovereignty, give the capacity to the governments so that they, and the decision making and the leadership to the governments, they are the duty bearers, and for us to take the role of supporting and filling in gaps where needed. But those gaps, if it's service delivery, education, health, wherever it may be, food assistance or security programs, should not be done by international actors. Those should be done by local organizations and civil society. And what we need from these actors in the global north is to exercise solidarity, exercise restraint and humility, and stop thinking of this sector as a business, stop acting like multinational corporations, like a Coca-Cola and these big guys who want to just, it's all about growth and growth and growth and big money and big money. And it's not about impact. It's not about, am I relevant? Am I needed? Where's my value add? Is this ethical? Is this principled? These are not the kinds of questions, unfortunately, that most of the executives in many of these organizations are struggling with. The only major question, some of the major question, the number one question is growth. How much money are you bringing in? How many countries are you working in? How many offices do you have around the world? It's a very corporatized way of thinking and very much modeling the private sector. They have a bunch of McKinsey advisors. Sorry to say that. I know someone mentioned McKinsey earlier. I mean, this is to me a huge problem. And so what I would like to see is that first and foremost, acting in solidarity and holding their governments accountable for this bad aid that's destroying countries like Somalia and other many list of examples. And solidarity means holding your own government accountable and not just being a passive agent of soft power of the political foreign policy of your government. That's what I would like to see these NGOs doing, and then also focusing on their own domestic issues. There's a lot of problems. COVID has revealed we have food banks and major problems of food insecurity in the UK and the US. Solve those problems before coming here to Africa.
Thank you for your very forthright words, and I'm very glad you're able to give a politically incorrect as well as a politically correct answer. I think that's exactly what academic centres of the kind that Cambridge welcome, that kind of discourse and debate where we can actually search for, truth, or a truer picture of what's happening. It sounds to me from your comments, Degan, that this might reflect not so much a tension between the balance of power of philanthropy in the north and the south, but a shift or a tussle between philanthropy that is elite and top down and that which is grassroots and maybe oriented in terms of solidarity. And I just wanted your very brief response to this question. That is, are there examples of African philanthropists, particularly in your part of the world, in East Africa, Central Africa, that you think are conducting themselves in a way that reflects a sensitivity to these issues and is doing a really good job? Is there some inspiration or examples of some of the philanthropists in Africa that you'd point to? And then just very briefly, and then we'll bring the other.
As I've said, philanthropy happens every day, and the most philanthropy by the poor. And that's the one that we should be lauding and documenting and appreciating. Having said that, if you were talking about big high net worth individuals, I would say none. I would say the biggest problem I'm seeing is that a lot of global South, particularly in Asia, but even now in Africa, high net worth individuals, the billionaires, are replicating the model of the global north. They want to be associated with global north brands. They want to be funding a UNICEF as and they unfortunately follow and mimic this behavior that I was talking about. So I'm very concerned about that. But are we seeing excellent philanthropy that's taking place through community foundations and what is happening in Kenya with KCDF and all over in West Africa and all over the continent? Yes, there's excellent, great example of community-led, community-organized philanthropy that does take place. And that's also something that we should be replicating and supporting.
Thank you. I can see we don't have that much time, but I do want to bring in SATRIJO just to come back on some of those points. And see whether you see it similarly or different than where you are.
Actually, I wanted to respond a little bit. I always appreciate funding. Giving. I always appreciate giving, small, big, People are very generous and people do give. Now, the problem, I cannot talk about the South. I talk about Indonesia, okay, and Singapore. That's all I can talk from the South part. You know, the problem in giving is that there is no institutional organization or institutionalized giving, I said it, that can create impact. This giving here, small things will create local small impacts. But if you want to create a big impact, you need to have an institutionalized giving. And that's, I think, what is important. From small giving, then we can put them together into a network to make it into a big, impactful giving. I don't think we should discount contribution from the North or from South. I would say contribution to a certain area, contribution to Indonesia. I don't think we should discount that. I think we should work together. You know, I give you an example. The problem of the international funder, you know, to come to Indonesia, for example, to address a certain problem. Normally, they work by project based. What do I mean by that? They work by project means, 3 years, after 3 years, after 4 years, after 5 years, and then they wrap up, it's finished, they go away. And the way they measure the impact is actually the output rather than the real impact. So, but I agree with Degan that probably we need to work together with the locals. And this is how I would like to see it more, because we, the locals, we work in Indonesia, we don't work there for 3-4 years and then leave. We work there forever, you know. So that basically means that if we really work together, then, or through the local, then we can really reach the impact, and with the government working together. So that's my addition to what Degan said.
Thank you, SATRIJO. And just want to pick up on a couple of comments in the chats. SA and also Harold are both pointing out some questions about new forms of success measures that might need to be put in place in order to think about what impact might look like. But with that, I just want to hand back just for a final word from our colleagues and sponsors at Cambridge for just their views on where this research will go and what questions are coming out of it that you are going to consider now for the next stages of your centre. Over to you, Clare and Kamal.
Yeah, well, just a quick soundbite from me, because Kamal is really driving our research agenda. But I would say it's a complex topic. You know, we really can't do it justice in the space of 1 hour. We found in the research, and we know this as practitioners, that there's such a heterogeneity to philanthropy. It means so many different things for so many different people. But I do think that now we have found a certain common ground for driving this discussion around the power balance, and I think that's really important for us. And I would say finally, just urge everybody, please do go and have a look at our report. You know, we want to get feedback from these markets. We want to work collaboratively with others out there. I think this is just the early stages of this conversation, and we very much want to be part of it.
Thank you. And Kamal?
Yeah, just building on what Clare said. We don't see this as a one-off report. I mean, just, happens to have taken place during a pandemic, but we see this as a manifesto. And we want to turn the center into a platform, right? And in collaboration, of course, with organizations like yours, Charles, and others around the world, but mostly focusing on emerging markets. And so we want to have more of these conversations because the picture is complex, right? The picture is complex because we need to talk more about the role of civil society versus the role of the government versus the role of the small philanthropist or volunteer versus, sort of what does it mean to work with corporates or work with high net worth individuals, and, sort of where are the lines drawn in the sand? Where does philanthropy have positive externalities versus negative externalities, and so on and so forth. So, we hope that this center can go on to become the platform, and in collaboration with everyone who's already doing this work in Africa, Asia, and other emerging markets.
Well, with that, thank you, Kamal. And I think that's all we have time for today. The hour has raced by. But if you enjoyed today's discussion, I'd like to bring your attention to two places where you can hear more on this topic. The first is a series of interviews conducted by the founding patron of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, Bader Jaffer. Check out Bader's conversations and interviews with philanthropists across the global south. They're featured on the Centre's website, on Alliance's website, and on the Centre's social media platforms. And they're very illuminating. It starts off with an interview with the Indian philanthropist, the Nilakanis, and we'll be going from there. So we'll be publishing more interviews in coming weeks and months. And of course, please tune into Alliance, more of Alliance's coverage on global philanthropy. We're offering everyone on this webinar a 20% discount on your Alliance subscription using the code Alliance25, which you can see in the offers tab on the right-hand side of your screen. But finally, thank you to our expert panelists, Clare, Woodcraft, and Kamal Munir from the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge Judge Business School, SATRIJO TANUDJOJO at the Tanoto Foundation, and Degan Ali at Adeso. You're all very interesting. All of you bring very interesting and different and complementary perspectives. So we're really grateful for your time and your expertise today. Thank you. And thanks to the Alliance team, Zibran Chowdhury and Amy McGoldrick, who produced today's event. And thanks to all of you for being part of Alliance community as we reach the milestone of being 25 years old. Up next on Alliance is the first webinar in our anniversary series, looking at philanthropy around the world and exploring where it's headed. And you can join Alliance's Ella Karuhi and guests for our webinar on the 16th of February to discuss the latest in philanthropy across the Arab region. You can sign up on our website at alliancemagazine.org. But until then, that's all from me and from our panelists. And thank you for joining us, and goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.